Ireland, Crimes and Mysteries with Newells.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Today's case takes us to the village of Whitegate, which is in the county of Clare. The village itself is situated close to the famous Lough Derg, which is the third biggest freshwater lake in Ireland and encompasses counties Clare, Galway and Tipperary. It is also home to the RNLI lifeboat, which is based out of Drumineer. Lough Derg is a long, narrow freshwater lake and at its deepest is 118 feet. In April of 1994, Whitegate would become the focal point of the whole country as a crime of immense magnitude would take place there, leaving the whole country reeling and the small village and surrounding areas never quite the same again. Brendan O'Donnell was 22 years of age in 1994 when he committed an unspeakable act of savagery that would end the lives of 3 innocent people, a young mother, her son, and that of a much-loved priest. To understand how and why this brutal crime took place in the first place, we must talk about Brendan. Brendan had suffered from psychiatric illness for most of his life. He had been prescribed Valium by the age of 4, something which would be unheard of in this day and age. This led him to suffer from nightmares and hallucinations, which as he grew older became more intense, to the point he thought people were trying to kill him. His mother suffered from depression and had been hospitalised several times when Brendan was a child. This gave Brendan a feeling of abandonment during his childhood. He had also been witness to things no child should ever have to witness, when on one occasion he saw his mother attempt to end it all. He had a violent father named Michael who would subject Brendan to beatings for no reason. He even beat him with a poker on one occasion. Several times his sister Anne-Marie, who was 4 years older than Brendan, had to rescue him from his dad, as the beatings would become so vicious she was afraid for his life. Brendan's mother had a fall in 1984 and would later pass away due to the injuries she sustained. As a 10-year-old, the loss of his mother had a profound effect on Brendan. His hallucinations escalated. He got very upset during the burial of his mother as he was convinced she was being buried alive. In the months following her death, he started displaying disturbing signs that his mental health once again was in freefall. At night time, he would go out and head to the cemetery and sleep on his mother's grave for the night. He also started getting into trouble, stealing cars and breaking into people's houses, and generally being seen as a nuisance in the area. People were beginning to fear Brendan O'Donnell despite his young age. His sister Anne-Marie, who was 14 at the time and had been living with their grandmother since she was 6 years old, moved back into the family home to take care of her younger siblings after their mother's passing. But this would not go very smoothly. Brendan had broken into a house where he had stolen a firearm. He went home and started brandishing it about, holding his whole family captive. They were all left traumatised after the event. This offence saw him arrested and charged and sent to a young offenders institute in Dublin called Trinity House. While at Trinity House, Brendan claimed that he had been violated by a member of staff at the institute. He ran away back home only to be brought straight back by his father. This would happen on several occasions, and each time his father would drive him from County Clare to Dublin back to the institute. The final time he ran away, he didn't go straight home, but instead went to Cregg Wood, where he would sleep rough. This wood was situated just outside the village of Whitegate. After one particularly harsh night in the woods, a cold and hungry Brendan would turn up at the front door of his second cousin, Tony Muggavan. Despite being cousins, the families weren't very close, but Tony did want to reach out to the young Brendan and proceeded to try and get him some help, some professional help. He had entrusted to Tony on the night he arrived at the house the story of what had happened to him at Trinity House Institute. He told Tony he wasn't feeling well mentally and begged him for help. Tony, feeling he wanted to help Brendan and give him a chance, especially after hearing what he had been through, decided to keep him hidden from the Gardaí and try to get him the help he needed. He tried several psychiatric hospitals to see would they take Brendan in. The first two refused him admission. The third one was willing to take Brendan in, but this was thwarted by the fact that Brendan's father wouldn't sign the papers to have him admitted. Tony, realising that Brendan's father was a big part of the problem, went to court to gain custody of Brendan, which he was successful in doing. He told Brendan he would not have to go back to Trinity House and instead could stay at his home where they would continue to get him the help that he needed. Over the following weeks, Brendan's mood was very up and down. Because he wasn't getting the proper psychiatric help that he so badly needed, he became very hard to live with, and Tony began to fear for the safety of his own family, so he had to ask Brendan to leave. Brendan then went to live with his grandmother, Mary Quinn, who lived in Aircourt, County Galway, and he would stay with her for 3 weeks. By the time he went to stay with his grandmother, Brendan's mental health was in a very precarious state. Because he hadn't been on any medication or getting any treatment, his hallucinations were getting far worse. This terrified Brendan's grandmother, who again had to ask him to leave for her own safety. By the late 80s and into the early 90s, Brendan's father had remarried and had had a son with his new wife. His sister Anne-Marie had also had a child of her own and was living in Portumna, County Galway, in the same area as Brendan was now living. One day Brendan called over to her and asked her to make him a sandwich. When he arrived, he seemed in good form, but in the blink of an eye his mood changed and he became vicious and began attacking his sister with a knife, trying to stab her in the chest. Thankfully he missed, but he did stab her in the knee. Anne-Marie managed to escape and ring the authorities, and Brendan ended up back in a psychiatric hospital where he would stay for 2 weeks. When he was initially arrested, Brendan told the Gardaí that he was convinced he had murdered his sister, and his reasoning for doing it was because she was trying to poison him with the sandwich. This only reinforced the fact that Brendan's hallucinations were getting worse. His sister Anne-Marie felt that he was even worse than ever after his stay in hospital, even more so than before he had went in, despite the fact his attack on her was the reason for his admission in the first place. On discharge from the hospital, he made his way to England, where he got himself into even more trouble, getting arrested again. But he skipped bail, and in 1994 he came back to the village of Whitegate. By now Brendan was 22 and had spent a large percentage of his life in and out of institutions, psychiatric hospitals and prisons. On his return to Whitegate, he returned to Cregg Wood, where he would set up camp, and this became his home for the foreseeable future. Imelda Riney, who was 29, was described by those who knew her as a free spirit. She enjoyed painting and taught pottery at the local schools. She had grown up in Terranure in Dublin, but later moved to London for a time, where she had been married and had 2 children, Oisín and Liam. After the marriage broke down in 1992, Imelda moved back to Ireland. On her return, she was drawn to the alternative lifestyle that she would enjoy in Whitegate, County Clare. Imelda was a confident and independent young woman who was well able to take care of herself and her small family. She lived in a remote cottage in Whitegate, which she loved and was well known in the area, often seen driving around the village in her red Ford Fiesta. Whitegate had become a go-to destination for artistic and alternative people who enjoyed the more peaceful way of life. Artists and poets from England and Germany and other parts of Europe could be found in the small little haven in County Clare. They coexisted with the locals in the village and the surrounding areas. They lived on small patches of land, some living off-grid entirely, and would sell their artwork or organic vegetables at the farmers' market. Some of them would buy little cottages and restore them to their former glory, which enhanced the area around Whitegate, Mount Shannon and Scariff. So it was no surprise when Imelda, with her artistic flair, settled in this picturesque part of the country and embraced the peaceful, easygoing lifestyle of the area. She remained on good terms with her ex-husband and he would regularly visit. On the morning of Friday, April the 29th, 1994, Imelda's ex-husband, who had been staying at the cottage that week, as he had been doing some work at the local school, got up early and dropped their son Oisín, who was 7, with the neighbours. leaving Imelda and her other son Liam, who was 3 at the time, asleep in the cottage. He had expected her to call in to him while he worked later that day, but she never showed up. At the time, he didn't think much of it. When he returned home after work, Imelda's car was gone and the house was silent. He noticed the gas cooker was still on with the kettle on the gas ring boiled dry and Imelda's tobacco pouch up on the countertop. She would never go anywhere without her tobacco, so this was strange. He looked around the house, but Imelda and her 3-year-old son Liam were nowhere to be seen. He was very concerned about their disappearance and alerted the Gardaí. Initially, because Imelda was seen as a free spirit and seen as a bohemian type, who would generally be known for moving around from place to place and living a carefree life, the Gardaí weren't too concerned and told him that she'd probably gone away for a few days. Imelda's car would be found burnt out a few days later in Loughrea near Aircourt. Media and news outlets did not hear about Imelda and Liam's disappearance until her ex-husband, concerned the authorities weren't taking him seriously, contacted them and gave them pictures of Imelda and Liam in the hope that it would garner some information as to their whereabouts. Or if Imelda saw the news reports, she would come forward herself. Everyone of a certain age remembers that now iconic photo of Imelda Riney with her lovely long red hair and her straw hat on the front pages of all the newspapers. The local hotel in Mount Shannon was now filled with reporters, and the name on all their lips was Brendan O'Donnell. They had tried the family home in Whitegate but had got no answer. As the media buzz around Imelda and Liam's disappearance began to hype up, the locals were becoming increasingly uneasy. How could this young mother and her little son just vanish? One witness had come forward saying on the day she disappeared, they had seen her car travelling northbound out of Whitegate. Her ex-husband said that this was not a route that Imelda would normally take or had any reason to be taking. They also stated that there was somebody else, another adult, in the car with her. When asked by the media if he was worried about her, he said he was desperately worried. Then a few days later, it was reported that a local curate from Aircourt in County Galway, some 40 kilometres from Whitegate, and coincidentally the same place Brendan's grandmother lived, Father Joe Walsh, who was 37 years of age, was also missing. Another car was found burnt out at the Williamstown Pier, which was just a few miles from Imelda's home. This car would be identified as belonging to Father Joe. On Saturday the 7th of May, the first car that had been found burnt out was identified as Imelda's. This was 8 days after they'd been reported missing, and it was only now that the Gardaí started to connect the 3 disappearances, and the search for Imelda and Liam intensified, as well as the search for Father Joe. The village was swarmed with detectives and armed Gardaí were dispatched from Dublin. The rumour mill was in full swing, as this was around the time of the Annie Murphy-Bishop Casey affair, which had come to light the previous year. And of course people started to wonder, had Imelda and Father Walsh been involved in some way? But of course, as the investigation progressed, a much more sinister reason for their disappearance would come to light. Gardaí had identified their main suspect as being that of Brendan O'Donnell, and the media were quick to get his face out into all the newspapers. The Gardaí appealed to Brendan directly to turn himself in. There was still no sign of Imelda, Liam or Father Joe. The place was awash with Gardaí, army and air support, plus volunteers, all looking for the 3 missing people. All this media attention and the increased Garda profile around the area freaked Brendan out. He knew his time was limited and his paranoia began to increase and his behaviour became more erratic. He broke into a family house with a pair of tights pulled over his head and kidnapped a 17-year-old girl. He then ordered her into the family car and told her to drive. He was determined to make his escape out of the area. He told her he wouldn't harm her and that he would let her go once he was safely away. The poor girl was terrified and ended up losing control of the car and crashing. The authorities were contacted immediately as someone had seen her being abducted and the area was swarmed with Gardaí and air support. One of the air support helicopters spotted the crash car and alerted the Gardaí on the ground. In the meantime, a local farmer had come upon Brendan and the young girl, who was very obviously terrified. He saw Brendan brandishing a firearm. When he saw the farmer, Brendan took this as an opportunity to steal the farmer's car and continue his escape. The farmer bravely confronted him and a scuffle ensued between Brendan and the farmer, with Brendan telling the farmer he was going to blow his effing head off. As the farmer tried to disarm him, the gun went off, piercing a hole through the roof of the car. Gardaí were on the scene very quickly and ran to the aid of the farmer, pushing Brendan to the ground and handcuffing him. The young girl and the farmer escaped uninjured, but were suffering from severe shock. This was not something you would expect to happen on a rural road in County Clare. They were taken to the local hospital to be checked out and later released. Brendan would later tell Gardaí, quote, that if he had had to end her life, he would have, and he said he had asked her if she was afraid of dying. Meanwhile, with Brendan now in custody, the search continued for Imelda, her 3-year-old son Liam, and Father Joe Walsh. The Gardaí were still hoping to find them alive, but that Saturday, the first of 3 grim discoveries were made in Cregg Wood after a very detailed search of the area, with the location of Father Joe's body in a shallow grave. The following day, Imelda and Liam's remains would be found in another shallow grave together, only 20 feet from where Father Joe had been found the previous day. All 3 victims had been killed execution style with shots to the head. Father Joe suffered 2 shots to the left side of his head. Imelda through her left eye, with little Liam meeting the same fate, a fatal shot to the left side of his head. The remains of the 3 victims were transferred to Ennis General Hospital for post-mortem before being released to the families. Father Joe's funeral took place in Aircourt, where massive crowds turned out to say their final farewell to the young priest, all still in disbelief that something this dreadful could happen on their doorstep to their beloved curate. Imelda Riney and her 3-year-old son Liam's funeral took place amidst a sea of grief and shock in St Leonard's Church in Whitegate, County Clare. People lined the streets in stunned silence as they watched the hearse carrying the remains of both the mother and the son pass them by. Nobody could believe how such an evil deed could be carried out in such a picturesque, quiet part of the country. The shock waves of this horrific tragedy had ripped through the very core of this small rural community. Meanwhile, Brendan O'Donnell was sent for psychiatric evaluation to assess if he would be fit to stand trial. The evaluation centred on 3 key questions. Did he know what he was doing? And if he did know what he was doing, was he aware that it was wrong? And if the answer to both of these questions was yes, would he have been able to stop himself? Dr. Ivor Shorts said of his evaluation of Brendan that he presented with psychotic symptoms, but this did not mean he was genuinely experiencing them. He studied his case notes and came to the conclusion that Brendan was very manipulative. Brendan had stated he was hearing voices and having visual hallucinations. Dr. Short said Brendan had shown no extreme distress from the voices, which he would have expected him to. He felt there were serious inconsistencies in Brendan's interview, and ultimately Brendan O'Donnell was considered fit for trial and appeared at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin on the 5th of January 1996, charged with the murders of Imelda Riney, Liam Riney and Father Joe Walsh. He pled not guilty. He also pled not guilty to having a .22 sportsman rifle and ammunition with the intent to endanger life and for unlawful purposes on the 7th of May 1994. He also denied falsely imprisoning the 17-year-old girl and the farmer on the same date. A jury of 6 men and 6 women were sworn in to hear the case. In his opening statement, Mr. Haw said that the case had been the subject of a media blitz and had gotten huge publicity, and advised the jury to ignore any rumours and speculation regarding the case and try Brendan O'Donnell on the evidence they would hear in court only. Confirming he was confident that the state would satisfy the jury and find the defendant was guilty on all charges. Brendan did make an attempt on his life during the trial, which delayed it by a few days. During the course of the trial, several witnesses were brought forward to give evidence. One man said that at around noon on the 29th of April he had witnessed Imelda Riney driving her car in Whitegate with a man in the back. He identified that man as being Brendan. Another woman would also say that she had seen Imelda in the car with another person in the back. On Saturday the 30th of April, a number plate and a piece of a bumper car had been found by a farmer on his land, but he initially disregarded it as not being of anything of significance until he later heard about the disappearances. The prosecution went on to say that Father Joe Walsh had been the main focus of attention when he was reported missing. He had been last seen at his own home in Aircourt, County Galway, just after midnight and was due to say Mass the following morning, Wednesday, May the 4th, but he didn't turn up, which stunned his loyal congregation as he was a very diligent priest and never missed a ceremony. As this was totally out of character and no one could get hold of him, he was reported missing. Brendan had been to Aircourt on the 3rd of May to visit his grandmother, who made him something to eat. When he left, he made his way to Father Joe's house. It was never established why he had targeted Father Joe. The following day, a taxi driver took the witness stand and told the court that he had seen a blue Opel Astra car and identified the man with the car as being Brendan O'Donnell. He said he knew Father Joe Walsh owned the car, but was confident that Brendan was driving it on May the 5th, 1994. The prosecution went on to say that the car was found burnt out on Williamstown Pier the following day, May the 6th, 1994, and it was later identified as Father Joe Walsh's car. Brendan had also been seen by a man who was doing a milk round that very morning in the area of Williamstown Pier, and he had reported the sighting to the Gardaí. This was the same morning that the 17-year-old girl was abducted from her home and forced to drive her family car by Brendan O'Donnell. She had drove the car some 7 or 8 miles before she went off the road. The prosecutor said that at this point Brendan O'Donnell forced the young girl, who was barefoot and wearing her nightdress, to walk along a rocky and boggy road with a firearm pointed at her. Brendan went into another house and tried to steal the keys to another car, but the owner of that house had been alerted to the break-in and discharged a shot to prevent this from happening. Brendan then took off with the 17-year-old girl, still held at gunpoint, before attempting to steal the car from the farmer. This was when the altercation took place. The prosecution said Mr. O'Donnell had the young girl as a prisoner and had put her into the farmer's car and had then tried to make the farmer drive the car, effectively taking him hostage as well. But the farmer, knowing he now had the support of the Gardaí, was brave and stood up to Brendan. At this stage, the area was totally surrounded by Gardaí and there was a helicopter flying overhead. A Garda fired 2 shots at the rear wheels of the car, prompting the farmer to grab the barrel of Brendan's firearm, which then discharged 2 rounds into the roof of the car. This briefly distracted Brendan, and Gardaí took this as an opportunity to grab him and pull him out of the car, where he was arrested. The prosecution counsel then went on to describe how Cregg Wood was then extensively searched and the bodies of Imelda and Liam were found. Both had been shot at close range with a single shot to the head. Imelda through her left eye socket and Liam in the left side of his head. Not far from them, the shallow grave containing the remains of Father Joe Walsh was also found. He had also been shot at close range in the left side of the head. When he was arrested, Brendan still had the firearm on his person that he had used to kidnap the young girl and the bullets in his pocket. These would later be identified as the same type of bullets used on Imelda, Liam and Father Joe. Counsel went on to say that the proper and only verdict is guilty on each and every one of the charges preferred against him. The events of what exactly happened on that day were laid out before the jury and were as follows. On the 29th of April, Brendan broke into Imelda's house, where she was spending the morning with her 3-year-old son Liam. He had a firearm on him, which he had stolen from another house earlier that day. He told her he wouldn't hurt her or Liam, but he needed her to be his getaway driver as he planned to rob the post office in Whitegate and needed a quick exit. Unfortunately, it had come to light that before they left the house, Brendan assaulted Imelda. He had said when questioned that it was all consensual and that they were in love, but the post-mortem results stated otherwise. As did statements from all those who knew and had spent time with Imelda in the run-up to her abduction and callous murder. These included statements from her sister, who had spent a lot of time with Imelda prior to these events. She said that not once had she ever heard Imelda mention the name Brendan or give any indication that she knew him or had embarked on a relationship with him. She stated she had spent time at Imelda's house a few weeks before she was taken and had never seen Brendan at the house or even knew of his existence until she saw him on the TV after his arrest. She said her sister would have told her if she was seeing someone, as they had told each other everything. Her ex-husband, who was staying at the cottage, backed up Imelda's sister's story, saying he had never seen or heard of Brendan O'Donnell either. So this statement from Brendan seems highly unlikely, and just another fantastical story made up in his head to talk himself out of the situation. After assaulting Imelda, he then forced her and Liam into the car and made her drive in the direction of Whitegate. This is when she was seen by other witnesses. Brendan had stated that he had noticed Imelda trying to signal to people that she was in trouble, but no one had copped this on. So unfortunately, nothing was reported to the Gardaí at this point. It was when he saw her trying to alert members of the public that he got angry with her. Seeing the fear in her eyes, he decided she would not be a very reliable getaway driver and ordered her to drive away from the post office, while he hid in the back with the gun pointed at her. On the road towards Woodford, Imelda had slowed the car down again, trying to alert passers-by to her predicament, but again they went unnoticed. By now, with little Liam crying in the car, Brendan was getting more irritated and just wanted the car off the main road and told her to drive towards Cregg Wood. He worried they'd been seen, so when they arrived, he ordered her to start walking into the woods. Terrified and carrying her little son some of the way, Imelda tried to reason with Brendan to no avail. When she saw an opportunity, she lunged at him to try and get the gun, but as she scuffled with him, the gun went off, striking her in the left eye. As Liam leant over towards his mother, he was shot too. He would later say he had made the decision to end little Liam's life because he didn't want him to grow up without a mother like he had done. Another indication he was not seeing Imelda romantically, as if he was, he would have known that she had another son that needed their mother too. He then dug a shallow grave, buried both mother and son together. And he went back to her car and drove it to Loughrea and had the wherewithal to take off the licence plate and set the car alight in an attempt to hide any potential evidence left behind. On the Tuesday, he went to his grandmother's in Ayr and she made him something to eat. His sister Anne-Marie stated in an interview that he had something on his person which at first he said was curtain rails and then said was a fishing rod. When she questioned him more on what it was, he told her to mind her own business. She said at this point she had no idea he had taken Imelda or her son on the previous Friday. She said there was always the possibility he would do something, but she never thought he would kill anybody. Her conclusion was that it was a build-up of his mental illness issues. After being at his grandmother's house, he then headed to Father Joe's house around midnight. He held him captive for several hours, and in this time Father Joe tried to talk him down and even offered him money and his watch for freedom. But this didn't work on Brendan. It only roiled him even more. He said he could hear a voice in his head saying, "Kill Father Joe. He's trying to christen the devil's baby's son." He made Father Joe drive his car out to Cregg Wood. Father Joe told him that he could take his life as long as it meant he wouldn't hurt anybody else. Brendan told him that he had to die, and he knelt Father Joe down and stood behind him and ended his life with 2 shots to the head. Father Joe dying instantly. Again, he buried him in a shallow grave, not far from where he had buried Imelda and Liam. He then drove his car to Williamstown Pier and set it alight. This was when he was spotted by locals driving Father Joe's car, and how he was connected to the disappearance. As the small village and surrounding areas became awash with Gardaí, media and volunteers, everybody trying to find the 3 missing people, Brendan was becoming increasingly agitated and anxious. This was when he decided he needed to get as far away as possible from the area. His idea was to steal a car, any car at the first opportunity. After casing the house and realising the young girl was home alone, he kidnapped her, made her drive the family car at gunpoint, and after she crashed, tried to hijack the car from the farmer. The defence argued the fact that Brendan's whole life had been a virtual hell and paid particular attention to his childhood and the mismanagement of his symptoms of mental health. The prosecution, on the other hand, said Brendan was a cunning, thinking, rational, clever, self-interested liar. The mountain of evidence that the prosecution had against Brendan was overwhelming, and after a 53-day trial, the jury found Brendan guilty of all 3 murders and he was handed 3 life sentences. He was transferred to Mountjoy Prison and later to Arbour Hill Prison. In Arbour Hill, he was attacked by a fellow inmate and was then transferred to the Central Mental Hospital. Brendan deteriorated both physically and mentally while in the Central Mental Hospital and was found non-responsive in his cell on the 24th of July 1997. He was then transferred to St Vincent's Hospital but was pronounced dead less than an hour later. At the inquest into his death, it was said that Brendan had expressed deep remorse for his crimes. He said he felt extremely sad and sorrowful over the deaths of Imelda, Liam and Father Joe. The inquest heard that Brendan had died a depressed and broken man and said he was constantly at war with himself and was always trying to harm himself. His psychiatrist said he was one of the most complex, troubled patients he had ever known. He had gone on hunger strikes several times and a few days before his death had even smashed his hand through a glass window pane. The state pathologist, Dr. John Harbison, gave evidence at the inquest saying Brendan had died from a fatal overdose of the drug Melorol, which if taken in large quantities can cause heart failure. A verdict at the inquest into his death of misadventure was reached. The people of Whitegate and the surrounding areas will never forget those few days in 1994 when their small, tranquil village was visited by an evil they never thought they would encounter. It seems inconceivable now that for a few weeks in the spring of 1994, the country was turned on its head by these shocking crimes at the hands of one man. The impact of their senseless murders left an indelible mark on the community, the grieving families, and I'm sure the legacy of these crimes lingers on to this day. The community of Whitegate and Aircourt bore the weight of an unimaginable grief. Their sense of safety was forever shattered. The families of Imelda and Liam Riney and Father Joe Walsh endured a pain that no one should ever have to bear. Their loss was immeasurable, their grief profound. The legacy of these heinous crimes is twofold. On the one hand, it serves as a haunting reminder of the capacity for darkness within our society. On the other hand, the legacy of Imelda and Liam Riney and Father Joe Walsh lives on in the hearts of those who knew them. Their memory, I'm sure, inspires acts of kindness, compassion and solidarity within their communities to this very day. The young girl who was kidnapped by Brendan went on to become a nurse and showed her resilience and determination not to let what happened to her define her life. Imelda's other son, Oisín, developed an artistic flair like his mother and has become a successful artist. Unfortunately, one of Imelda's sisters did pass away in 2012 from asphyxia after she collapsed at home. But Imelda's mother's strength did shine through and she only passed away in 2022 at the age of 99. I remember this case very well and I remember all the media hype around it. This was in the days before social media, so every day people were turning on their TVs or buying a newspaper to find out the latest update on the case. People were stunned by what happened and everyone struggled to understand how it could happen in the first place. As the news unfolded, the whole country was overwhelmed at the brutality of the crime and how this could happen to a young mother and her young child in this peaceful, safe haven. It was unbelievable to most people. And then hearing about Father Joe, nobody could believe it as the news unfolded. Every day brought more shocking news on the case. I can still see that lovely picture of Imelda on the front page of all the newspapers with her lovely long red hair and straw hat. That picture captivated the country. And then little Liam's photo, a picture of innocence looking up at you. He was everybody's child. Father Joe, who looked like a lovely young curate with a pleasant face. He died pleading with Brendan to make his death Brendan's last. His parishioners appeared to love and respect him, which says a lot about his character. 3 people who still had so much to offer in life, taken way too soon. Brendan was a troubled man. It's a complex case. Some argue that Brendan was so troubled that ultimately this outcome was unavoidable, while others argue that he was able to manipulate and deceive using his mental health as a crutch to lay the fault of what happened on. But what happened to Imelda, Liam and Father Joe should never have happened, no matter the real reason. It shows what can happen if people are left untreated with certain conditions or misdiagnosed or mismanaged, which may or may not have been the case with Brendan. How things can turn bad very fast. Whether Brendan was a cold-blooded killer or a victim of his past is of no solace to the Riney and Walsh families. As I conclude this episode, I keep Imelda, Liam and Father Joe to the forefront of my thoughts, as I'm sure we all do. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.
You've been listening to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries with Newells. Join us for another episode coming real soon.